Hello everyone and welcome to my Soap Twist 24 channel. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. The rain pelted the windows of the small, poorly lighted apartment, each drop a tiny hammer hitting the glass, reflecting Thomas's heartache. He stood in the kitchen, his hands quivering, grasping the edge of the counter as if it were the only thing keeping him grounded. Ridge remained unmoving across from him, his face etched with defiance and remorse, and the air between them was thick with unsaid accusations. On the counter, a knife lay abandoned, its blade gleaming in the flickering fluorescent light. Thomas's voice was low and raw, almost a growl. "Put the knife down or I'll call the cops." The words hung heavy, like a line carved in the sand of their broken family. Ridge's gaze shifted to the knife and then back to Thomas, his jaw hardening. He didn't move to pick it up, but he didn't back away either. The tension was a living creature, coiling tighter by the second. It wasn't just about the knife. It was about Taylor, treachery, and the dissolution of everything Thomas believed in. Thomas had always admired his father, Ridge. In his view, the man was a titan, charismatic, successful, and capable of commanding a room with a single glance. Growing up, Thomas clung to Ridge's every word and gesture, hoping to emulate him. Taylor, Ridge's mother, provided a soothing counterbalance to his passion. She provided warmth and humor, dressed his scratched knees, and read him stories when the world seemed too huge. They formed an unshakable basis for his existence. Or so he thought. The news had arrived like a thunderclap. Taylor was gone. Not dead or missing, but simply gone. Left, walked out, and vanished into the night without a word. Thomas had been working on a project in New York when he received the phone call from his sister, Steffi. Her voice was tense and strained as she told him how their mother had packed a single bag and departed their vast family estate in Los Angeles. No explanation, no goodbye. Just left. Thomas was initially skeptical. Taylor wasn't the type who ran. She was consistent and trustworthy, the glue that held their tumultuous family together. He'd flown back right once, his mind spinning with possibilities. Maybe she was unwell, maybe she was coerced, or it was all a misunderstanding. But when he came, the reality was far worse than he had expected. Ridge had driven her away. The story unfolded in shards, stitched together by Steffi's hesitant admissions and whispers from family friends. Ridge had been aloof for months, preoccupied with his career, ambitions, and his own world. He stopped listening to Taylor and seeing her. She had attempted to approach him, to bridge the growing distance, but Ridge had ignored her, too preoccupied with his own life to notice hers disintegrating. The final straw, Steffi claimed, was Taylor discovering a letter. Not a love letter, but something worse. Ridge had signed a contract without informing her, one that linked their family's heritage to a rival company Taylor had spent years battling against. It was a betrayal, not of love, but of trust, partnership, and everything they had built together. Taylor confronted Ridge, who ignored her concerns, telling her she was exaggerating. So she departed. There was no fight or screaming match, just a quiet, resolute departure. She chose not to tell Thomas or Steffi because she did not want to burden them with her grief. However, the lack of her warmth and constant presence left Thomas with a void in his bones. Now, standing in the kitchen, Thomas was filled with wrath as he glanced at his father, the man he had once worshipped. "You let her go," he exclaimed, his voice breaking. "You didn't even try to stop her." Ridge's expression tightened. "You do not comprehend, Thomas. It wasn't that simple." Thomas raised his voice, letting out a nasty laugh. "She was your wife, Mama. And you just let her go away like she was nothing." Ridge took a step forward, raising his hands to quiet a savage animal. "I did not want this. I had no idea she was hurting so badly. She never mentioned. She shouldn't have had to." Thomas smashed his hand on the counter, causing the knife to jump slightly. "You were supposed to see it. You were meant to care. Using the knife was a terrible error." Thomas had been slicing vegetables when Ridge walked in, trying to justify himself, and the conversation had gotten so heated that Thomas had forgotten he was still holding it. He'd waved it in the air, not threateningly, but enough to narrow Ridge's eyes and cause him to take a step back. And now they were at a stalemate, the knife a symbol of something far worse than either of them could describe. Ridge's voice softened, yet it had an edge. "Put that down, Thomas. This is not you. You don't get to tell me who I am," Thomas responded. "Not after this. Not after you broke our family." The words stabbed deeper than any sword. Ridge flinched, and Thomas noticed a flicker in his father's eyes. Guilt, perhaps, or sorrow. But that wasn't enough. It would never be sufficient. Thomas put down the knife, not because Ridge asked, but because he didn't trust himself to hold it any longer. His hands were too shaky, and his vision was obscured by tears that he refused to shed. "I'm going to find her," he declared, his voice low and solid like a vow. "And when I do, I'll make sure she understands she's not alone. That's enough. Even if you never did." He turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving Ridge standing there, the weight of his son's words more powerful than any threat. The rain outside had subsided to a drizzle, but the world felt no less cold. Thomas spent the next many weeks hunting for Taylor. He began with the obvious locations: her sister's house in San Francisco, her old college friend's cabin in Colorado, but she was not present. She'd done a good job of covering her traces, as if she knew he'd come seeking. Steffi assisted when she could, but she was dealing with her own sadness and hatred toward their father. The siblings clung to one another, their shared sorrow creating a tenuous kinship in the face of so much uncertainty. He engaged a private investigator, Daniel, a quiet man who specialized in locating people who did not want to be discovered. Thomas ignored Daniel's warning that it could take months, if not years. He would look for the rest of his life if he had to. Every lead, every dead end, reminded him of what he'd lost, not only his mother but the family he'd assumed they were. The hunt led him to unexpected locations. Taylor has previously discussed retiring to a little seaside town in Oregon.
A bookstore in Seattle, where the owner barely remembered a woman fitting Taylor's description purchasing a stack of poetry books. A volunteer at a women's shelter in Portland said that a kind, quiet woman had remained for a few nights and helped with the cooking before leaving. Each clue was a breadcrumb that led Thomas both closer and further away. In the quiet moments, when the leads dried up and the world felt too huge, Thomas would sit in his hotel room and look at old images on his phone. Taylor smiles at his high school graduation. Taylor and Steffi are giggling during a family cookout. Years ago, Taylor and Ridge were dancing at a charity banquet, their love so evident that it hurts to look at now. He wondered if she'd ever return, forgive Ridge, or forgive him for not recognizing her anguish sooner. The resentment toward Ridge did not go away, but it did shift. It wasn't simply rage anymore. It was a profound, painful sadness, the understanding that the man he'd admired was just that, a flawed man capable of failing. Thomas stopped phoning him and answering his texts. Steffi explained that Ridge was struggling and trying to make things right, but Thomas didn't care. Not yet. Perhaps not ever. Months passed, and the trail became colder. Daniel advised Thomas that Taylor might not want to be found and that individuals depart for a variety of reasons other than being lost. Thomas despised the idea that his mother would choose isolation over her children. But deep down he understood. Taylor had given everything to her family and Ridge, but it wasn't enough. Perhaps she needed to rediscover herself, to recall who she was beyond being a wife, mother, and caregiver. Thomas received the call one night while sitting in a small cafe in a remote hamlet in Northern California. Daniel's tone was calm and professional, yet there was a hint of enthusiasm. "I found her," he explained. "She is in Mendocino, a small art gallery by the coast. She works there and lives in a cottage nearby." Thomas boarded the following aircraft. He did not tell Steffi or anyone else. He needed to see her to make sure she was okay. The drive from the airport to Mendocino was a blur, with the coastal route twisting through fog and redwoods. When he arrived, the gallery was small and inconspicuous, featuring paintings of the water and rocks. And there she was. Taylor appeared different, but not in the way he had dreaded. Her hair was shorter and grayer than he recalled, and she was dressed in a baggy sweater and jeans rather than the sophisticated dresses she used to wear. But her eyes remained the same, warm and sympathetic, with a trace of sadness that made Thomas's chest hurt. She was assisting a customer, her voice smooth and steady, and Thomas simply observed, hesitant to break the spell. When the customer left, Taylor looked up and noticed him. Her expression froze, then softened, as if surprised and relieved. "Thomas," she replied, scarcely rising above a whisper. He crossed the room in 3 steps and drew her into an embrace, hugging her so hard he was frightened she might shatter. She hugged him back, and for the first time in months, Thomas felt able to breathe. They talked for hours while sitting on the cottage's veranda, which overlooked the beach. Taylor told him everything: how Ridge's dismissal had harmed her, how she had felt invisible, and how she had needed to leave to find herself again. She wasn't angry anymore, only tired. She had found calm in Mendocino, in the quiet rhythm of the gallery, in the art, and by the sea. She wasn't ready to come home yet, but she promised to call Steffi and stay in touch. Thomas informed her about his rage, his search, and his dread of losing her forever. She listened, her hand resting on his, and when he finished, she added, "I apologize for leaving without notifying you. I needed to save myself." "I know," Thomas answered with conviction. He stayed for a week, helping at the gallery and strolling the cliffs with her, savoring every minute. When he departed, he did not ask her to return. He knew she'd return when she was ready, assuming she ever was. For the time being, all that mattered was that she was secure and mending. Thomas returned to Los Angeles, but did not visit Ridge. He wasn't ready to forgive just yet. But he felt lighter, as if the weight of his fury had been lifted, making way for something else. Hope, perhaps, or the beginning of understanding. The family was still shattered, but not gone. Neither was he. The rain continued to fall, although it did not feel as heavy as before. "Put the knife down, or I'll call the police," Thomas said in the dimly lit kitchen, his voice wavering despite his efforts to sound authoritative. His eyes were glazed with fury and anguish, and his hands shook as he glanced across the room at the man who had previously been the most powerful person in his life. The knife glinted in the dim light. Ridge's eyes were lifeless and hollow, as if he'd lost all conviction. He wasn't holding the knife to threaten anyone, but the way it hovered near his wrist worried Thomas. It had not always been like this. Their home had once been filled with laughter, warmth, and the security of a seemingly unbreakable family. Taylor's calm voice had anchored the turmoil, and Ridge's presence had always served as a solid foundation on which they could all stand. But suddenly, everything seemed beyond repair. Thomas had discovered the facts in the most horrible manner. Ridge had abandoned Taylor, not just physically, but in all aspects of loyalty, trust, and love. He had left the family, not just the house. When Thomas first discovered it, the rage inside him felt like it would consume him completely. His mother had been delicate for years, carrying the weight of her past, but Ridge had promised her safety. He had pledged to always be present, and Thomas trusted him. Taylor's stillness seemed louder than any shout. She had withdrawn inside herself, and Thomas couldn't see the light in her eyes anymore. "Why, Dad? Why her? Why now?" Thomas's voice cracked as he asked the questions he'd been holding back for weeks. His fists clenched and unclenched, and he could hear his pulse screaming. "Mom gave you everything." Ridge lowered the knife and slumped his shoulders. His face appeared older, as if years had piled up in a matter of weeks. "Thomas, I couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't fake. I have been living a lie, a lie." Thomas cut him off, his voice getting louder with each syllable. "So all of those years were a lie? Were you lying when you said we were the most important thing in your life at family gatherings, holidays, and other occasions?" His eyes burned with tears that he refused to shed. "You have devastated Mom. You broke her," Ridge said, his lips quivering. He attempted to speak, but no words came. He finally laid the knife down on the counter, but the consequences of his decisions were just as cutting as any blade. Thomas snatched the knife and threw it into the sink, the clang reverberating throughout the empty home. "You don't get to do this," he snarled with clenched teeth. "You cannot destroy her and then ruin yourself. That's not how this ends." The silence that followed was oppressive. Thomas remembered nights when his mother sat at the piano, her hands gliding over the keys, and Ridge stood behind her, resting a hand on her shoulder. Those modest acts had formerly served as confirmation of an unshakable affection. They now felt like scenes from someone else's life, distant and out of reach. Taylor did not leave her room anymore. She hardly ate. The light that once guided Thomas had gone out, and he despised Ridge for it. He despised him for robbing her of joy, making her doubt herself, and making her feel inadequate. "Do you even realize what you have done?" Thomas muttered, finally allowed his tears to fall. His voice was softer now, yet every syllable hit like a stone. "She feels she was not good enough for you. She believes it's her fault. She blames herself every day." Ridge covered his face with his fists, trembling his shoulders. "It was not her. That was me. It was always me. I did not deserve her affection, Thomas. I still don't." Thomas wanted to yell, shatter something, and hit the wall until his knuckles cracked. But instead, he simply stared at the man who had once been his hero but now resembled nothing more than a shattered stranger. "You don't get it," Thomas finally replied. "You had something real. You had a family. You had love. You traded it for empty. You don't simply leave someone who has been through everything with you. You do not leave Mom." The words lingered heavy in the air, and neither of them talked for a long time. In the weeks that followed, the house became a battlefield of stillness. Taylor remained in her room, Ridge slept on the couch, and Thomas attempted to pull himself together. But late at night, as he lay awake staring at the ceiling, he felt the weight of grief press against his chest. He reflected on the life they could have had, one in which Ridge stayed, Taylor laughed, and the family remained intact. But that life was gone. And no matter how badly he wanted it back, or how much he hoped he could go back in time, the fracture could not be undone. One evening, Thomas sat outside Taylor's chamber, listening to her weep. He placed his forehead against the door and said, "I will protect you, Mom. Even if he doesn't, I'll never leave you." It was a pledge formed of anguish, carved on the ashes of what had been lost. Thomas realized he couldn't fix Ridge. He couldn't make him love Taylor again or change the mistakes that had brought them here. But he could stick by her even when everything else fell apart. Taylor was inside the room when he heard him. She didn't respond, but for the first time in weeks, her weeping subsided. She felt a little flash of strength from deep inside, since even if her marriage was in shambles, she still had her son. And Thomas, although being broken and enraged, knew he would have to bear that burden. He would bear both of their hearts, even while his own was heavy with sadness. Because, in the end, love was not about grandiose promises or flawless narratives. It was about remaining, even if it hurt. It was about being the last one standing after everyone else had walked away. And so Thomas stayed.